It was nearing dusk when Detective Sarah Blake received the call. She had been winding down after a long day when dispatch sent her out to the old Birchwood House. An elderly neighbor had reported strange noises, whispers and crying, coming from the place. Sarah sighed. She wasn't a believer in the town's ghost stories, but Birchwood House was notorious in Miller's Point. Ever since the Kendricks family tragedy, it had been the subject of endless rumors. The case, a brutal murder-suicide, had been cold for years, but that hadn't stopped the town from speculating. As Sarah drove toward the house, the sun hung low on the horizon, casting long shadows over the narrow road. Birchwood House appeared out of the woods like something forgotten. It was crumbling now, its windows gaping and black. Vines crawled up the faded facade, as though the earth itself was trying to reclaim it. A stillness clung to the air, and the wind carried an odd scent, damp earth and mildew. When she stepped out of her car, Sarah felt a twinge of unease. The air was cooler than it should have been, but she dismissed it as the shade from the trees. Birchwood was just an old, abandoned house, nothing more. She approached the front door, feeling the uneven boards creak beneath her feet. She hesitated briefly before pushing it open. The door creaked, and the sound echoed unervingly through the house. Inside, the air was stale, and the temperature seemed to drop further. The first thing she noticed was the quiet. It was too quiet, as though the world outside had been muffled. Her footsteps sounded unnaturally loud on the wooden floor, stirring up dust in lazy swirls. "Hello," she called out, her voice feeling small in the vast empty space. No response. She took a breath, listening. Faintly, she thought she heard something, a soft cry, a whisper. She held her breath, waiting for it to come again. But there was only silence. Sarah exhaled, shaking her head. "It's just an old house," she reminded herself. Houses like this creaked and groaned as they settled, especially when they'd been left untouched for years. But the stillness persisted, and so did the chill. She walked through the dim rooms, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. The rooms were in disrepair, dust thick on the surfaces, old furniture draped with tattered sheets. Cobwebs clung to the ceiling beams. In one corner, she spotted an old portrait of the Kendricks family, the edges fraying from years of neglect. The figures stared back at her, frozen in time, their expressions distant. As Sarah moved through the house, that strange sound returned, faint and distant like a sigh carried on the wind. It was coming from upstairs. She paused, straining her ears. The crying grew slightly louder, though it was still barely audible, almost like it was coming from deep within the walls. Her pulse quickened, but she steeled herself. She wasn't afraid of ghost stories, and she wasn't about to be spooked by some strange acoustics in an old house. She climbed the stairs, each step groaning beneath her weight. As she reached the top, the air felt even colder, almost unnaturally so. Her breath fogged in front of her, despite the warmth outside. At the end of the hallway was the master bedroom, the door slightly ajar. The whispering seemed to be coming from there. Sarah pushed the door open cautiously, her flashlight sweeping across the room. It was empty, just like the rest of the house. But the cold here was sharper, biting into her skin. She could feel the weight of something unseen pressing down on her. Then she noticed it, a fleeting movement near the bed, caught at the edge of her vision. Sarah paused. For the briefest second, she could have sworn something had shifted in the dim light, a flicker of shadow perhaps. Her pulse quickened, and her breath slowed as she peered into the room. Was someone else here? Or was it simply the interplay of light and darkness in a house so still and abandoned? Her flashlight faltered for a moment, the beam wavering across the room. She swept it over the spot again, her skin prickling with the weight of the silence. The air seemed heavier now, almost stifling, like the building itself was watching her. But when she stepped closer and focused on where she thought the movement had been, there was nothing. The room was just as it had been, dusty, empty, and long untouched. Sarah shook her head, exhaling slowly. Her mind was playing tricks on her, surely. The house was old, Shadows could seem alive in such places. But as she moved, her foot caught on something uneven. She looked down and noticed a floorboard near the bed, slightly raised from the others. Her heart began to race, not from fear but from anticipation. She crouched, nudging the board with her fingertips, and with little effort it shifted. Beneath, tucked carefully away, was a small box, worn with age and dust. With trembling hands she opened it. Inside was a knife, its blade dulled with time, yet unmistakably stained. The missing murder weapon, hidden away all these years. She stood slowly, the box clutched tightly in her hands, her mind replaying the moment she thought she'd seen that flicker of movement. The room now felt still, almost calm, but a strange tension hung in the air. It was the kind of feeling that lingered, making her feel as though she wasn't alone, even when her eyes told her otherwise. As Sarah made her way back toward the door, she cast one last glance over her shoulder. The flashlight caught something just for an instant. A reflection, perhaps, or maybe a shifting shadow. But for a split second, she could have sworn she saw it again, something standing near the bed. Or was it just the shadows playing tricks on her tired mind? When she looked again, there was nothing. Just the empty room, and the faint groaning of the old floorboards beneath her feet. Outside, the night air was a welcome relief from the staleness inside, but the sense of unease clung to her like a second skin. As she drove away, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there with her, even if logic told her it was all in her head. Maybe it had been nothing at all. Or maybe it hadn't.